Hi, welcome to Now You Know. My name is Kosherdotcom Leitner from Spice and Zest, and I will teach you everything you need to know about sourdough baking. Today we're going to be talking about a sourdough starter and everything you need to know about the starter. A strong and happy starter is the foundation to baking sourdough bread and getting great results. When I started over a decade ago, there was very little resources on sourdough starter, and I definitely wasn't able to get one. So I had to start one from scratch, and here it is, my trusty starter that's 12 years old now. But today you can get a starter from a friend, a relative, or you can always pick up the dry starter in all the kosher supermarkets. There's instructions in here with a video on how to revive it, so you got yourself a nice strong starter. Or you can always check out my website, spiceandzest.com. I have step-by-step instructions on how to create your own starter from scratch. Now I will show you how to feed a starter. Feeding a starter is what keeps your starter alive and gets your starter ready for baking. This is a starter, and feeding a starter means when you put in equal amounts of flour and water by weight into your starter, you're always going to weigh it with a scale. You're going to put your jar on the scale, which I'll show you soon, and put equal amounts of flour and water. The type of flour you use really doesn't matter. I suggest to use bread flour. Make sure it is unbleached bread flour because bread flour is the most resilient and the easiest to maintain. I add also about 20% of whole wheat flour because the whole wheat has the extra nutrients in it, which keeps your starter stronger. When feeding your starter, you're always going to feed your existing starter, but you don't want too much of your starter in your jar because that's going to overpower the new starter and your starter is going to become very acidic and sour. So always make sure that you only have about 1 to 2 tablespoons of your old starter. And if you have more, then you're going to pour off, which this is called discard. If you've ever heard of that term, discarding the starter is when you get rid of this starter, which is not active starter anymore. At this point, you can either discard it or there's lots of recipes you can find for discard starter. This is the existing starter that we are going to be feeding now. If you see, this is how much I left in here. It's approximately 1 to 2 tablespoons. No need to stress about the exact amount as long as you have a little bit of your starter, and then you're going to be feeding it the equal amounts of flour and water. Now we are going to feed our starter. You're going to look at the recipe and see the amount that you need. If a recipe calls for 100 grams of starter, you're going to feed it 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water. That's going to equal to the 100 grams. And you have a little bit of your old starter in here, so that's going to be left over for you to be able to feed again next time. And this is how you're going to keep your starter alive and going constantly. You put the jar on the scale and bring down the scale to 0, and then we're going to feed our starter 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water because we need 100 grams for our bread that we are going to be baking later. Bring it back down to 0, and we got 50 grams of water. If you have a little bit too much water or flour, don't stress over it. If it's not the exact number, you're not going to ruin your starter, and just stressing over it is just going to overwhelm the whole process. So it's okay if you're up or down a number. What we're going to do now is mix our starter, and you're going to get a pasty consistency. It's going to be somewhere between a dough and a batter. And we're going to let it sit for about 8 to 10 hours depending on the temperature in your environment. If it's too warm, then it's going to grow much faster. If it's in a cool environment, it's going to grow much slower. And you want to look active, something like this, before you can use it for baking. So this is our starter, which we're going to leave on the counter now for about 8 to 10 hours until it is active and ready to use. I like to put a rubber around where it was fed. This way I can tell how much it grew and if it's double in size, because an active starter will be double in size and have fluff bubbles all over, which I will discuss soon. When covering it, do not cover it airtight because when the starter grows, it will produce gas, and if it's airtight, it can explode. So I like to just put this on top just like that, or you can use a cloth to cover it and leave it at room temperature until it is ready to use. Now I'm going to show you the stages of the starter, how to know when the starter is ready, how to know if the starter has deflated already and you can't use it for baking, and how to store your starter for next time. This is an active and ready starter. You'll see that it's full of bubbles, some bigger bubbles, some smaller bubbles, uneven bubbles. If you see the top, it's nice and it has a little bounce to it, and it should be double in size. If you put rubber or anything to measure it, then you would be able to tell that it's double in size. And then you know that your starter is strong and it's ready to be used for baking. This starter is a starter that we just fed. This is what it looks like just after feeding. The consistency is, like I mentioned earlier, not a dough, not a batter, like that in between kind of doughy consistency. And this starter is, once it is active and bubbly, you have a window of about 2 to 3 hours that you can use your starter for baking, and then it starts to deflate. At that point, you cannot use it for baking bread because the yeast in the starter is starting to die down, and you're not going to get a strong bread. You can use it for discard recipes. And how do you know when it deflated? There is, first of all, you can always see around your jar. When you see it's all dirty, you know that it grew and it fell down again. Also, the consistency is very liquidy. You'll see it's liquid and it has no bubbles in it. At that point, if you want to use it for baking, you're going to have to refeed it again and wait. Or you can put it in the refrigerator and store it until you're ready to use it next time, and then you're going to feed it. Many of you have this misconception that you have to babysit your starter and feed it every single day, and this might be what is overwhelming you and preventing you from starting your sourdough journey. But I'm here to tell you that you don't have to feed your starter every day. Once you have a strong, active starter, you can store it in the fridge when not in use, and just remove it from the fridge and feed it as you would before baking. You might have to give it 1 or 2 feedings before it is nice and active. So always remove it from the fridge 2 days in advance, feed it, wait a little bit, and then if you see that it's not as active, you're gonna pour off most of it and feed it again. And at that point, you should be able to bake 8 to 10 hours later. And that's how you can just have a starter and not feed it daily and forget about it for the most part. And now you know everything you need to know about a sourdough starter. In our next segment, we will be talking about baking sourdough bread.